Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, and today's video is about the heart and matters relating to the heart. I've got lots of presentations that I've either presented or are in the making. So this is part of a presentation that I've already presented, but it's also a work in progress because I want to explain to people why the heart isn't a pump, but then it then dives quite deeply into biogeometry and things like water vortices. I've also gone over some science regarding mythology about fat and cholesterol, because no matter what, I think a lot of people still are very confused and think cholesterol and fat is something that's trying to kill them. Dr. Tom Cowan and Dr. Stephen Hussey have written good books on the heart and talked about this idea of the heart not being a pump, as have many other people. It's not me that thought of this. I've just listened to and read a lot about the heart, and then I wanted to pass this information on to you, and then you can decide for yourselves what you think the heart is. So we've got something scientific, and then we go into the heart not being a pump, which is about physics. And then because the heart relates into the biofield in the body and the energetics, which, as you know, I'm very keen on and think is very important, because there's a lot of physics now to back up things like a biofield, an aura, action at a distance, intention, telepathy, remote viewing, and things like that. So it's nice to also have that part of my little presentation on the heart for people who are also like-minded and interested in a bit more, because like I keep saying, we're not just a lump of meat. With some of this presentation, it's from some of this presentation's also from a large course that I've been building over about a year and a half, which is about ketosis and quantum health combined. So it's for practitioners, but also it's for very keen lay people who want to learn. This is a work in progress version because I think it's also important to share content publicly as well. Let's begin. I had a quick look at some medical stats just to prepare for this, to set the scene for you. And heart disease is still the #1 cause of death globally. And interestingly, suicide is now fourth. And this is in people aged 15 to 29. So that's very serious, again, linking into emotions and the brain. Also, regarding the brain and the nervous system, there are now 3.4 billion neurological disorders, according to the Lancet, and 1 billion mental health issues or cases reported. So it's clear that somewhere there's a big misunderstanding of actually how the brain and consciousness and all of that and our nervous system functions, but also heart disease being #1, there's clearly a huge lack in knowledge and understanding of what the heart actually is and how it works. So what I want to do is I want to talk about why the heart isn't a pump, and also go into some of the biogeometry of the heart and talk about it in a bit more of what I would say a quantum sense. But quantum can mean so many different things, be it the sort of spirituality side of the heart center, the heart creating a biofield, which we can measure, the heart having memory, as from stories of when people have had a heart transplant and taken on memories of the donor. So, and quantum also encompasses light and magnetism and water. And there's a lot I could say about the heart in relation to sort of the biophysics. I'm also going to do a little bit of a reminder of people on why fat isn't bad and why cholesterol is not the enemy, because there's plenty of studies and research going against this narrative of we must lower fat and we must always have the lowest cholesterol. So I'm going to lead you in with all of that, just so that we can start on a sort of more scientific front, because I think when we start to talk about the heart doing things like making gravity and talking about golden ratio vortices, which are all bona fide physics, I think it's better if we just begin somewhere where we can all have a common ground. So I made this talk and other talks, and also it's part of my quantum ketogenesis course, because one of the biggest oppositions that anybody gets who wants to, say, be keto or go carnivore, or just wants to eat meat, are, of course, cardiologists who tell people that meat and fat's bad, vegans, just general trolls on the internet. Google, ChatGPT is full of misinformation, and it's very hard to actually get it to reference anything for you. You have to dig it out of it. And then, as we know from typing things into Google, it's a wealth of misinformation. And then still sort of 50 years or more later, after Ansel Keys and his studies, the top answer is still going to be that eating keto or carnivore and fat is going to cause heart disease. And the big problem here is none of them know what the heart is or how it even works. So that's why I want to talk to you later about the heart not being a pump. So I don't mind if you don't believe anything I say. It's not about that. It's about learning how to think for yourself and to draw information from different sources and also learn how to apply physics to biology. Then you'll see how little medicine and science really understand about the heart. And like everything, I always urge you to do your own research and question things and always look a bit deeper. My background is biochemistry and biology, but a very long time ago, I realized that there was a lot more to understanding biology and life, which is why I got into understanding or learning about physics and how to apply that to biology. And like I said, I want to give you a flavour of the quantum nature of the heart, because another thing about the heart is a lot of people only take any notice of it when they've developed a problem. And by then, I don't want to say too late, but, prevention is better than cure. For those who already follow a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet, you'll know that this beating of the cholesterol is evil drum has been going on for ages. And it really is, I find, a big distraction from a lot of other things which are very, very damaging to the heart, which people need to know about. And also this idea that the heart's a pump. And as I've mentioned before about us not just being a lump of meat, the heart isn't just a lump of meat that pumps blood around the body. It doesn't even work like that. So there are fundamental misunderstandings of circulation and the heart. I just want to go over some quick research just for people who might be completely new to this channel. Want to start with a bit of science. So there was a study, the Cochrane study about reduction in saturated fat intake for cardiovascular disease. There was a big review, and in 2020, the conclusion was people who reduced saturated fat were just as likely to die from heart disease and other causes as those who ate more saturated fat. Then another study in 2021, a meta-study, the association between dietary fats and the incidence of cardiovascular outcomes. And this concluded saturated fat was not associated with a higher risk of heart disease. Association of carbohydrate and fat intake for cardiovascular disease and mortality in Australian women. This study concluded in women consuming saturated fat didn't increase the risk of heart disease or death and may be linked to a lower risk of other conditions, including obesity, type 2 diabetes, and high blood pressure. So we're getting somewhere now. In PLOS medicine, this was on fat intake from dairy and incidence of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. And I can't say I'm a fan of dairy, but butter and ghee, I think, are very sort of valuable and useful. So what this said was consuming higher amounts of saturated fat from dairy could actually be associated with a reduced risk of heart disease. So this is just a little bit of a taster in of where we're at with the saturated fat. So there's other studies I could have shown you, but there isn't any evidence to show that eating saturated fat causes heart disease. And the same with cholesterol. Another thing which gets blamed all the time for disease is red meat. And this is an extract from an article in 2022. And it was from the researchers from the University of Washington Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And they looked at scrutinizing actually how studies on red meat have been done, because there's a lot of, well, we'll just say fudging and dodginess in the data. So what they concluded was they found weak evidence of association between unprocessed red meat consumption, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes, and ischemic heart disease. Moreover, we found no evidence of association between unprocessed meat, ischemic stroke, or hemorrhagic stroke. Coming from a research science background, I do know that there are a huge amount of flaws in how the studies are conducted, who pays for them, what type of study it was. So I'm not saying that scientific research is useless. You just have to be really careful nowadays interpreting the data. And also there are a lot of areas of biology, for example, deuterium and water, that are not popular to study because they're not funded properly, because there's no end gain, as in there's no sort of drug at the end of it. So far we can see that fat is fine, and then so is red meat. Just for people, again, who are wondering, well, what was wrong with these red meat studies? Well, first of all, nearly all the research was observational, and they're epidemiological studies, which are good for testing a hypothesis, but they don't report on causation. When you have groups of people who are just allowed to basically do whatever they want, and then they fill in some questionnaires for you about how much meat they ate per week, you don't know other variables. They might be smokers, you don't know where they live, you don't know how much they exercise. The other problems in these meat studies, there's very loose definitions of what meat actually is. So a hot dog, a ham sandwich, a doner kebab, they were all classed as meat in some of these studies. And of course, we know that they come with bread and carbs. So we can't just blame the meat for what the bread did. The other big problem is lots of these studies are not controlled properly, and it's based on people self-reporting food consumption. And having worked with people and clients and patients a lot, we're not very good at reporting truthfully what we actually do. Of course, a lot of it's by accident. And there are, of course, people who do track very well. But then just asking people, oh, how many eggs did you eat this month? And how many pieces of meat did you eat over the month of, say, June? People can't remember. Because if somebody just asked you randomly, can you tell me exactly how many glasses of wine you drank from the beginning of May, and exactly how many pieces of bacon did you eat? You don't really know unless you're a meticulous food tracker. So there's huge amounts of problems in doing these kinds of studies when it comes to meat. Then another one of my favorite subjects is cholesterol. I've made another video all about cholesterol, but I'll just go over it again just for people who may be new to this channel. So first of all, the first cholesterol myth, there's no good or bad cholesterol. If you look in a textbook, there's only one cholesterol. Technically, there is another one called cholesterol sulfate, which I'm just going to touch on at the end of this. But in terms of what the mainstream talk about with good and bad cholesterol, they're referring to lipoproteins, HDL and LDL. So there's only one cholesterol. We need it in our cell membranes. But also from a quantum biology perspective, it's something called a non-visual photoreceptor. And that's something that helps to propagate light signals all around the body. And that's another one of the reasons why there's so much cholesterol in the brain, because it's the main non-visual photoreceptor in the brain. There are other non-visual photoreceptors like neuropsin, these kind of molecules. Vitamin D could be classed as one. So it's basically something which propagates light around the body to use lighter signaling, but you don't actually use it for seeing with. The other thing about cholesterol is if you look at the biochemical pathway, it's made out of acetyl-CoA, and that means that you can make cholesterol out of protein, out of glucose, out of snake skins, all sorts of things. So all food can potentially be made into cholesterol. Then the other big myth is there's no such thing as a cholesterol test. It's called a lipid panel. And this is where you test things like LDL, HDL, which are lipoproteins. So they contain cholesterol, but they also contain many other things. And they're a bit like an envelope or a package. So it's a little, we'll just pretend it's a ball. We don't know exactly what shape it is, but it's a little envelope or parcel, and it carries many other molecules around the body. And the other important thing about a lipid panel, it's no good without other lab results. So you should always look at other things like a glucose panel where you'd have HbA1c, insulin, glucose, and then other markers for inflammation like HSCRP, things like high ferritin can be an inflammation marker, as can high TSH, lots of things. Because the other important thing about cholesterol is it's an anti-inflammatory molecule. So sometimes people have elevated cholesterol because of inflammation, and the cholesterol is there trying to help. Cholesterol myth 3 is that abnormal lipid panels can report on something that's got nothing to do with what you eat. For example, stress can change the levels of lipids in the blood. Inflammation can. Simply just eating too much can cause changes in the lipids in the bloods. And also looking at a lipid panel can be an indirect report of insulin resistance. And this can be from eating excessive carbs in a blue lit world, eating excessive carbs, full stop, eating excessive carbohydrate without adequate ultraviolet A exposure. And then the other really important one is circadian mismatch. So that can be things like having a lot of technology and light in your bedroom so you don't sleep properly. That's going to affect lipid panels. It's going to affect markers for insulin resistance. So there are a huge amount of other factors that play a role in these lipid panels. The other very important thing about lipids is that you're only looking at a snapshot of those lipids over about 2 seconds when the blood's actually drawn. And lipid levels fluctuate a lot during the day. So you're only taking a snapshot. And when we come to look at blood and what it is, when you look at what's actually in the blood after it's been processed in a lab, it's not the same as looking at natural blood flowing in the veins, because that's a whole totally different consistency, because of course we have the water there as well. So I'm not saying there's anything that you must stop getting lipid panels. I'm just saying that there's lots of reasons why they're a tool and not a rule. But my main issue is about people just getting a lipid panel and then being told by, say, the doctor, oh, you've got high cholesterol, you've got high LDL, you must start eating more whole grains and stop this ridiculous keto and carnivore. That's just terrible to base everything just on one panel and one marker. Something I find interesting about LDL is what it can do and does. It can stabilize your inner mitochondrial membrane. So with our mitochondria, they're a bit like a capacitor, just in simple terms. So they can store a huge amount of charge. And the inner mitochondrial membrane is an insulator, and it's a chemical barrier. And it also sits around about minus 180 millivolts. And then the cristae are these sort of bag-like extensions on the inner boundary of the mitochondria. And the crista membrane, that's where the electron transport chain is housed. So this is the place in the mitochondria where the water, the metabolic water is produced, the deuterium depleted water, and that's where the ATPase is that spins and makes ATP. So they're housed in the crista membrane. And you need a really good stable inner mitochondrial membrane, because if the membrane isn't stable, we could imagine how it's a bit like sort of slightly faulty electrics. The efficiency of the flow of electrons, or the electric field, whatever we want to call it, is going to be impaired. And LDL is important for stabilizing this sort of electrical circuit in the mitochondria. So it plays a very important role inside the mitochondria, and a lot of people don't talk about this. So another thing I want to touch on is the LDL stress response, because magnesium is really important for lots of reactions in the body, but very important in the mitochondria as part of the energy production, the water, and also for producing ATP. So under stress, we do lose magnesium, and also ATP production can go down. The other thing that can happen is under stress, cells can become dehydrated, as in they lose their fourth phase or their coherent or exclusion zone water. So this is the water that can, the gel-like crystalline water that can charge separate. And under stress, the mitochondria need more electrons to pass the oxygen to make extra ATP to account for the stress. So if there's a reduction in exclusion zone water, or we can say the water battery, this means there's now going to be less electrons available to run the electron transport chain. So what happens under stress is there can be a fall in both ATP and magnesium levels. And what happens here is this stimulates the cells to make more LDL cholesterol, because, as I said, the raised LDL can help the mitochondria keep their electric charge and sort of be like an insulator, so they can run electrons down the electron transport chain, and also it can help them to concentrate the protons or the hydrogen, the H plus, in the mitochondrial matrix to run down the ATPase. So I went into a bit of a long-winded explanation here, but the crux of it is that, for example, a hospital that's an extremely stressful environment would trigger this lowering in ATP and magnesium. And then that means the patient's LDL is going to jump up, because all the body is trying to do is find a way to insulate the mitochondria a bit more electrically to try and recover some function. So a lot of people do get lipid panels or blood tests run in hospital, and they discover, oh goodness, the LDL is terribly high. You must go on statins. When nobody questioned, I wonder if it was the hospital environment that actually created the stress which made the LDL go up in the first place. But also this can apply to anybody who's new to quantum biology and is new to this idea of the fourth phase of water and grounding, and avoiding non-native EMF and blue light, or not avoiding, but mitigating. So this is also important for other people who are new to a quantum approach to health and discussing things like grounding, expanding or exclusion zone water, near infrared light. So you could see that maybe you have high LDL because of a stress factor. Maybe you do have cellular dehydration, and this could be another reason why LDL has been elevated, and it's completely unrelated to what you're eating. So you need to deal with the stress, the loss of easy water, the lack of electrons, and the lack of magnesium. So just to summarize, fat and cholesterol are really important because 60% of the brain is made of fat. And also I mentioned earlier about cholesterol not only supporting membranes, but it's a very important non-visual photoreceptor in the brain. Then both fats and cholesterol are needed to keep cell membranes functional and intact. And I just used the example of the mitochondrial membrane. The other important thing is fat is needed to absorb nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin K2. And interestingly, all of these are fluorophores. And also vitamin K2 is an interesting molecule because, a bit like vitamin D, it has the ability to absorb UVA and UVB light. So vitamin K2 is, again, a really important player in how vitamin K2 is also an important player in cardiac health, because people get very upset about cholesterol, but then they neglect to talk about how calcium and calcium dysregulation also play a huge role in the health of the interior of arteries. And as you may know, vitamin K2 is an important player in this. Because it's a fluorophore, I would strongly suggest getting your vitamin K2 from a natural source, because it has been charged by the sun, or it's been programmed by light. But on the other hand, because K2 is so useful, there are certain situations where people do explore a good quality natural supplement. And then just to finish off, we know that fat and cholesterol are very important for the body's defenses. And I haven't covered this in this presentation, but fat's also low in deuterium. I just wanted to add a little bit here about sulfate and briefly touch on cholesterol sulfate. So sulfate, we can think about it can be a storage molecule. It's important in the gut microbiome for methylation, blood flow, brain development, and also anti-atherosclerotic properties. And in terms of sulfate regulation, sunlight is crucially important for the actual timing in the biochemical pathways. And an interesting thing which cholesterol sulfate does, it stabilizes cell membranes, for example, red blood cells, so they don't end up bursting. Another important role of cholesterol sulfate is it can regulate sperm capacitation. So this is very important for fertility rates, because if you do look at the stats, you'll see that there is a drop in fertility. So cholesterol sulfate is important for sperm. Another thing which cholesterol sulfate does is it regulates serine proteases. So it plays a pivotal role in blood clotting and fibrinolysis. So again, another factor to do with blood flow that a lot of people don't talk about, which would be the role of sulfate and cholesterol sulfate. The other thing as well on this subject of clotting factors, cholesterol sulfate can inhibit thrombin, and this is the principal clotting factor right at the center of the molecular events that result in a blood clot. I've put some references below if you wanted to check it out more, because I think a lot of people have not heard of cholesterol sulfate. So just to summarize here, the mainstream narrative will try and tell you that you want to lower your cholesterol, and low cholesterol is the way forward. So I don't agree here. No. We've got mood issues. So depression, anger, and violent behavior can be linked to low levels of cholesterol, increased chances of infection, detox issues because bile is made out of cholesterol. There's increased chances of Alzheimer's and dementia, then cholesterol, vitamin A, and thyroid combine together to make pregnenolone, which is our master sex hormone, and all other sex hormones are made out of pregnenolone. So if we don't have enough cholesterol, then this could lead to things like early menopause, no libido, low progesterone, which can cause sleep problems and stress. Osteoporosis is linked into low testosterone and estrogen. And the other thing about having low cholesterol, it doesn't protect you against heart disease, and it doesn't make you live longer either. So we've now set the scene about cholesterol mythology. Now, the bigger problem is heart mythology. So the current view on the heart is the heart's a pump, and that would be, in fluid dynamic language, a pressure propulsion device. So when the heart muscles contract or squeezes, it creates a pressure which pushes the blood through the arteries, through the capillaries, and through the veins and back to the heart. Then, just quickly, the mainstream narrative says that heart disease is caused by plaques that contain cholesterol, and that's the main culprit. And also there's some calcium and protein and macrophages that build up in the coronary arteries. They seem to only build up in the coronary arteries, not other arteries, but the mainstream narrative just ignores that. And then these blockages in the coronary arteries mean that the heart gets starved of oxygen, and then cells die, and then it results in a heart attack. So that's what the mainstream narrative is. Because this is a very big topic, luckily Dr. Stephen Hussey is very kindly going to come on the channel and give you a very big overview of clots and blood flow and this topic. He's written more than one book on the heart, and he also himself had a heart attack, and he had a CAC score of nothing, so he's going to give personal accounts as well. Right, so back to the simple thing about the heart, and is it a pump? So we don't need to get very technical or complicated with biochemistry of clots. So first of all, if we just think, what is blood? So it's proteins, lipids, glucose, red blood cells. So it's not runny, it's sort of viscous and it's sticky. And it's not like water that could just flow easily. And the other important thing about blood is some of the red blood cells are actually bigger than the capillaries that they're supposed to go down. So how do they do that? Then if we think, okay, what's a blood vessel? So it's a flexible hydrophilic tube. And how many miles of these hydrophilic tubes do we have in the body? So in an adult, there's about 60,000 miles of blood vessels. And how much does a heart weigh? So it can weigh between 200 to 400 to 500 grams, so 7 to 10 ounces. So we've got this really small muscle that's got to push all of this blood, which is not smooth, it's sticky and full of stuff, including red blood cells that are bigger than some of the vessels that it goes down. So how is this little tiny organ supposed to push all of this blood, which is effectively 2 times around the Earth, as well as have the power to force a red blood cell to change shape and go down a capillary? So even if I explained this to, say, my mother or a 7-year-old, they would just not see, well, that can't be a pump. It's not really possible. Then in another simple analogies, which Dr. Tom Cowan has also talked about in his book, The Cosmic Heart, that the heart isn't in the right place to be a pump, because say if you had a house at the top of the hill and you wanted to get water up to your house, you'd put the pump at the bottom of the hill to push the water up, not in the middle of the hill, because it just doesn't make any sense to put the pump in the middle of the body. So technically, if the heart was a pump, we'd need it in our feet. So if we think about the fluid dynamics, or just simple ideas of how water or fluids flow. So where does the blood flow the fastest? So it flows the quickest in the arteries, and then by the time it's got to the capillaries, which you can sort of imagine like an estuary or something, and the water just slowly diffuses out. It's very slow flowing now. So you have to think, okay, in the capillaries, what's going to speed the blood back up again to push it back up to the heart? You'd need sort of millions of little pumps inside the capillaries to do this. And then the other important thing about the actual structure of the heart. So there are people who have worked on hearts or seen heart surgery, um, worked in a lab where there are live hearts. And when the heart beats, the aorta, which is sort of like a flexible tube, when it pumps, it actually curves inwards, not straightens. So if the heart was pushing or pumping out, what would happen is that this aortic arch would straighten, but it doesn't do that. It actually goes the opposite way. So this shows or strongly implies that there's not a pushing force, it's a suction, or what we'd call a negative pressure. And all of these things you can observe for yourself and think for yourself. And some people are just satisfied at these explanations and think, okay, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. The heart can't be a pump. So what is it then? So one part of the heart, we can describe it as being a hydraulic ram, but more fundamentally and more importantly, it's also a vortexer. You may have heard of the heart being described as a hydraulic ram and a vortexer. So briefly, a hydraulic ram is a device that holds flowing water in a holding tank. So that would be the atria or the ventricles, and they have a flexible holding area. And behind this, there's the gating mechanism, which is the heart valves. So the overall effect of this hydraulic ram structure and the vortices means that the heart doesn't force or propel the blood out of itself because it's too small to do that, to push. But this setup means it can suck. As this is a gentle dive into what the heart is, I'm going to let Dr. Hussey explain more about the actual mechanics of the blood flow. I want to now move into what's a vortex, because I think this is another very important aspect of how the heart functions. So this comes into what shape is the heart really. Frank Chester, who studied the geometry of the heart, found that the shape of the ventricles are actually a chestahedron shape. These sit at a 36 degrees angle to the left. And if we look at the geometry of the left ventricle, it matches this chestahedron perfectly. And the importance of this chestahedron shape is that a spinning chestahedron in water can form a vortex. And this vortex, I've had a picture of it here, we can think of like a spiral. I'll show some pictures in a moment of the heart muscle contraction, but it's been known for a long time that when the heart muscle itself contracts, it does so in a spiral fashion and makes a vortex. And this vortexing is also important for how the heart produces its huge torus field or toroidal field or the biofield of the body. Just having a look here, we can see the way in which the muscles are arranged in the heart or the ventricle, so that when it contracts, we can see that this spiral pattern is going to produce a vortex in the blood. So I'll just have a picture here of what this vortex potentially could look like. So here's an image here of the spiral pattern of the heart and how it creates this spiral or this vortex of blood flow. Some more important biogeometry of the heart is that when the heart fascia is unraveled, it's a double helix. And these ventricles, or the chestahedrons, these are also close to the golden ratio, or phi, which is 1.618. I'll have to do a whole other video to talk about phi, the golden ratio, fractality. But just in simple terms, if we investigate biology and many different parameters in biology, ranging from planetary precession all the way down to the hydrogen radii and parameters in photosynthesis, also the Schumann resonance. Dan Winter saw the relationship between the golden ratio times Planck, and there are about 200 biological variables which comply to this ratio. But also when we start to look at the anatomy of important things in the body, like DNA, for example, that golden ratio appears over and over. It also appears in the molecular structure of the bond angles of water. And with this golden ratio, first of all, the heart, it's the ventricles themselves, the chestahedrons, have a golden ratio geometry. But then when we start to look at things like the heartbeat and So golden ratio isn't only for geometry, it can also be for specific timing events in the body. So perfect pressure and time points of an arterial pulse flow in an ideal world follow or should follow the golden ratio. So this would be sort of the timing. Then when we look into things like the heart Mayer wave, which is 0.1 hertz, and then if we look deeper into how brain waves and heart rhythms synchronize, these would be what we call golden ratio cascades. So when it comes to how the heart works, we also need to appreciate that, yes, it's a vortex, but it also has important electrical and timekeeping properties in the body, and it has a very strong link with brain waves. So heart math, if you're interested, is somewhere where these kind of brain waves and heart rhythms and the synchronicity between them are very important for, we can say, entering meditative states, calming the body, meditation. So when it comes to the heart, there's just so much more to it than just being a lump of meat that pumps. And I'm only sort of scratching the surface here, just introducing you to looking at the anatomy of the body in a different way, looking at it through a different lens. Then back to this vortex again. In this paper here in Nature Reviews and Cardiology in 2014, we can explore a little bit more about these vortexing patterns of the flow of the blood in the heart. Because of the vortexing nature of the heart, it also does something else that's very interesting, is that these vortices can make gravity, or we can also call that voltage. Because when we start to talk about things like gravity, magnetism, charge, or dielectric, they are fundamentally modalities of the same thing. And Dan Winter, when I talked about this when we did our podcast, so you'll learn a lot more about gravity and golden ratio and vortices in that interview, or you can check out some of his work if you can understand him. When it comes to water vortices, this is nothing new at all. Victor Scharberger and then his son Walter and his grandson Jörg Scharberger probably would be the most famous pioneers of the study of water flow dynamics. And when it comes to what you can do with water vortices, it's pretty outstanding. The water wizard, as he was called, was Victor Scharberger, and then his son Walter carried on his work. He was an inventor, and he deserves a whole podcast just for his work to be presented. But luckily, his grandson Jörg is still alive. So with the Scharbergers and those who carried on his work looking at the power of vortex water, because biogeometry and water vortices is actually genuinely used for water sanitation. It's used in fish farms and also for crops. And what I find the most interesting is that just seeds growing next to a water vortexer grow even faster, and they don't even get any of the vortexed water. So this vortex isn't purely about just moving blood around in a particular way. When the water's vortexed, it's also a means to energize. If we revisit the heart and it vortexing, we can see now that there's a lot more to this vortex and this intricate design of the heart and the way in which the fluid dynamics in the heart occur. So there's an energy or an energetic effect. So if the heart successfully vortexes the blood, it's not only moving it about, there's also the potential, as I said, to energize the blood flow. The other interesting thing about vortexing the blood, when the heart misvortexes, this can also be seen as people having raised blood pressure. I want to thank my sponsor, Lightwater Scientific, who helped me deliver free, valuable information to you and also allow me to have great guests on this channel. Lightwater Scientific produce the purest and most deuterium-depleted water in the world. Depleting or lowering your deuterium has numerous health benefits, from better metabolic health, more energy, greater resilience, less brain fog, increased physical performance, enhanced healing, and healthier mitochondria. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, also known as heavy water, because it's bigger and heavier than regular hydrogen. Even though deuterium makes up only 0.02% of hydrogen, it's found everywhere. Deuterium is a burden to your body because it interferes with the intricate chemical reactions that occur by slowing them down. Deuterium is kryptonite to your mitochondria, and we need healthy mitochondria to produce energy. There's over 60 years of scientific research on the negative effects of too much deuterium on health and also the positive benefits of lowering deuterium in the body. Like water, deuterium depleted water is 100% safe and non-toxic. In fact, it's the closest in structure to the metabolic water that your mitochondria produce. Like water, deuterium depleted water comes in 5 or 10 parts per million glass or plastic bottles. So level up your health by leveling down your deuterium today. The purchase link is in the show notes and use code Dr. Sarah for a discount off your order. It's now you can see how all of this starts to begin to tie into something called our biofield, which, being a scientist in the beginning, I thought things like this were complete nonsense. But the more I've gone into the study of the heart, bioenergetics, and I would just say spiritual practices, my view is completely changed on this now. So just to end on this toroidal field, that pretty much every ancient practice, including what we'd call modern religion, has some sort of internal toroidal field making ritual or meditation. And you can actually measure the biofield as well. And when somebody's in a state of love versus a fear state, we know actually that their biofield significantly shrinks. And because this biofield is a torus of energy just continuously circulating, you want to basically keep this energy system flowing and keep it in. So if you're unfamiliar with a torus, here's a picture here. Here's a little animation here. I did an interview with Carrie Bennett where we talked a lot more about energy from the ether and things like our own internal energy system and how we want to keep this flow large and then continuous. And this then ties into what I just want to finish on, because it's all very good to talk about science, but there's also spirituality, which we can't really ignore nowadays, especially that if we look back into pretty much every ancient practice, whatever you want to pick, be it modern religions or other ancient practices, there's always some kind of heart center meditation or focus, or some kind of ritual of internal toroidal field making. I just want to add this here because in terms of the heart center from a more esoteric or spiritual level, I just become more and more and more interested in it because, first of all, there's pretty much in every religious practice or anything, modern or ancient, a huge focus on the heart center, the energy of the heart center, the heart chakra, doing things from a seat of love, even things like remote viewing. There's a lot of people who say that you actually remote view through your heart center, not through your brain. That's another sort of topic. Then when people have studied biofields, they do change size depending on the person's emotion. And if we think about, I put a picture here, when someone's in a love state, the biofield and the torus is huge. And then when somebody's in a fear state, this torus has become extremely contracted. And because this is also our field of energy, some people might want to call it the aura or a cloud of charge or their personal plasma, whatever you want to call it, it's energy. So when people are in a fear state, your energy packaging or your torus or your biofield has shrunk. And this is probably one of the most sort of draining things on people. Dr. Darko covered this as well. He talked about how living in fear or stress is a huge drain on charge. And then from a quantum biology perspective, or just life in general, we always want more energy or more charge. Then to link this back into, well, how come you've ended up here? I thought we were talking about the heart. I actually looked into a study recently, and it said one of the biggest risk factors for a heart disease or heart problems was depression. And I think this is very understudied, and people focus too much on the biochemistry and forget about the emotional side of the body and how destructive fear or living in fear, having depression can be on the heart. So I just wanted to end just to talk a little bit more about something that we can all explore, sort of spiritual practices. I don't mind, what you choose to follow. It's completely up to you as long as you do it properly. But just to finish off at the end, that there's an extremely important emotional component to heart. When it comes to the physics of things like biofields and auras and charge, Dr. Konstantin Korotkov has published several books, I think like 13, and I can't remember how many papers, something like 200. So he's a Russian researcher who's looked in depth at auras and charge, and he has something called a biowell machine that can measure auras and biofields and charge. Professor Konstantin Korotkov is who I know best in this field because I've actually met him. And there are other scientists, of course, who do study plasma and biofields. So just to summarize about the heart, or as I'd say, just to summarize about the heart and why it's just not a lump of meat that pumps blood around the body, it's actually a hydraulic ram vortex. Then your heart's full of blood, which an iron's magnetic, and then it's also full of water, and water's a dipole. And then moving magnetic things around in an electric field is going to cause the heart to make a gigantic EMF, like a toroidal field, which reaches about 22 feet out of the body. So I did say that with this biofield, it's not something that I've made up. You can actually measure them, and this has been done over and over. The other important thing the heart does, it sets a rhythm for the rest of the body, so it's clock within itself. It also has memory, because there are plenty of anecdotes about people who've received a heart transplant and then taken on board the characteristics and memories of the donor. So there's a lot we don't understand about memory and the heart and the brain. The heart definitely has an energy center. It's up to you to explore that for yourselves. And for certain, the heart-brain connection is extremely powerful. When I did hypnosis a lot, I discovered this for myself by accident, and then incorporated it into sessions and found I got a much better result. And then later, I discovered things like heart math, Dan Winter, people like Patrick Botti, and all of the studies linking the heart and brain waves together. But also just from a perspective of how we communicate and talk to each other about the heart, that when we get a broken heart from love, is like it's totally crushing. And we say things like, oh yeah, I feel it in my heart, and from the bottom of my heart, having a heart of gold, a broken heart. So sometimes I wonder, actually, is the heart actually even conscious? So who knows? Thank you very much for watching. If you are interested in learning more from me, I have a coaching group. I do one-to-one consultations. I have free PDFs on different topics and courses on quantum biology. I've also been working for a very long time on a quantum ketosis course. So it's about circadian biology, deuterium, different ways of eating that would be classed as ketogenic. So it's not just a straight medical keto, because as you know, I do raw keto. I've also included in this course about people who are transitioning out of plant-based and want to do vegetarian keto. And of course, carnivore can be classed as zero carb. So it's a course for practitioners, but it's also for people who are very interested in quantum biology. So it's taken me a long time to make, and there's probably about 12 modules now. If you're interested, you can register to go on the waiting list. And also, because it is a practitioner course, it has got CPD attached to it. But I also want to offer a couple of scholarships to people who would like to be a practitioner, but are not ready financially, but genuinely want to practice. So there will be different criteria to qualify for this, because I don't want to give the course away to somebody who's not going to use it. You have to actually show that you are going to then go out and use the course. And you'll get more details if you register for the waiting list.